So the topic of our first session today is understanding the history and treatment of trauma. Um, One of the most interesting things that we deal with in the academic world, if you will, and I think it bleeds over into practice, is the idea that we are at the pinnacle of our development and that we are as good or better than we've ever been. So I want to begin to address that idea, which is in the terms of history considered a bias called presentism, believing that the present is always better than what went before. Because we have had remarkable people in the field of mental health, psychology, and research that have been working on understanding how to treat trauma for a very long time. And many of them have been quite successful in doing so. But the historical characters and the historical learnings frequently get lost in the shuffle of modern day models of treatment. So what I want to start with for your benefit is more or less an quick overview of some, if you want to think of it this way, a pre-modern world of trauma treatment. I want to talk to you initially about the first trauma therapists that we know of. Now, we have lots of names for them, whether we call them shamans, native healers, or by some other name. They basically became healers of trauma in their communities. In many ways, these folks believed that they had been called by the spirits to do the work of healing. It wasn't exactly a voluntary thing. Usually, all of them had some early life severe injury, disease, or experience, including some serious mental health issues and near-death experiences that sensitize them to the needs of other people. And if you want to think of that as a starting point, what we really could say is that those people that were initially the native healers were very good examples of what we might consider post-traumatic growth. In other words, after their experience, as awful and horrible as it was, they were able to move past it. They were able to improve the quality of their own life, and they were able to serve the communities within which they lived to bring relief, to bring healing, and to bring, in a lot of ways, a sense of order to a chaotic world. An experience of being rebuilt differently is often recorded in the folklore of different native populations. The idea that the healer or the shaman, or sometimes we refer them as indigenous healers, those folks, because of what they experienced, they were rebuilt, redeveloped, regrown, if you will, excuse me, regrown into a different person. That is completely in line with what we often experience with people that have trauma, is that going through the process often changes fundamentally who they are, how they think, how they feel. And when they heal from the hurt of trauma, most of them enter a stage of post-traumatic growth that is tremendous, not only in psychological and emotional ways, but quite often in a spiritual way as well. So for the next little bit, when I talk about shamans being the first trauma therapists, I want to kind of address the idea that shamanic practice um, is focused primarily on the energy of life, and it looked at everything else as secondary. So the shaman's career was really to be of spiritual service to the community within which they lived. Is that so different from what we do as counselors, therapists, social workers? Aren't we really in the spiritual care of a population in our community? And I'm not, when I say spiritual, I'm not certainly not addressing a religious philosophy in that, but that the care and feeding of the human spirit is tied to the practice of psychotherapy and counseling. Some of the methods used by the ancient shamans, and I'm going to draw some parallels towards what we do in the mental health field even today. Some of the avenues for healing that the shamans used in their work was first journeying. And journeying was really kind of the entering of a trance state. And the process of going into a trance state was to give them the ability to move through different levels of spirit. Now, I want to reconceptualize that a little bit, because what they're looking at is a lower, a middle, and a higher world of spirits. But when we start looking at trauma work, aren't we doing some similar things by the way we structure treatment? Aren't we looking for a beginning, middle, and end in all narrative work? Are we looking for just before the event, and then the state that occurs at the end of the event, and move through it so often and so quickly and so thoroughly that it desensitizes people to the experiences and allows them to digest and absorb it? That's not a lot different than the journeying work that was done by ancient shamans and native healers. They also use trance work, which is an altered state of consciousness, sometimes called the shamanic state of consciousness. And while in trance, their perceptions were supposed to extend beyond the limitations of their immediate senses and their body's function. I think we see some really good examples of that in not only hypnosis work, but in EMDR and progressive counting, and Oxenberg's counting method, where what we're doing basically is helping people achieve an altered state of consciousness, and we're helping them move through the experience in an imaginative way, using an imaginal process to help them work through the issues related to trauma. So we also help them learn to look at the perceptions of their body and the experiences of their body very much differently than they have been before. So in at least these two areas of journeying and trance state, we aren't terribly different in concept than what the ancient shamans and indigenous healers used to provide relief for people that were suffering. We have created processes, and we've created structure, and we've gotten all sorts of different names and labels for these, and we've organized them in different ways. But essentially, the process that we are looking at is not terribly different. Another one of the avenues for bringing relief to those that needed healing by the ancient indigenous healers was the introduction of spirit guides. These were teachers or guardians who existed in the spirit realm, and these spirits or entities were to assist people that were here to finish or complete their business so that they can move on to the next part of their journey. One of the things I really enjoyed, about 3 years ago, I was talking to a friend while I was doing some training, and they are from a northern Arizona native population. And he mentioned that he always looked at counselors as being primarily spirit guides. I hadn't thought of it in that perspective before, but I would imagine that we could take that as a thought process. Aren't we really serving the function of a spirit guide? That these guides are helping people complete unfinished business so that they can move on to the next phase of their life. Isn't that really the whole purpose of our counseling experience with folks, is to help them finish unfinished business, to put a period at the end of their experience and be able to move on in a more productive way for the rest of their personal life journey. So I really like that idea of thinking about this field of practice from that perspective of being a spirit guide. Next concept that native healers worked with was the idea of loss of soul, teaching people to recover or heal from a loss of soul. And the loss of soul was really interesting. It wasn't just that I don't like myself or I feel lost, um, or it feels like a part of me has gone missing and we have to go search for it. But in some of the accounts historically that I've heard in folklore, I want you to think about how human some of this really was. In one of the accounts that I was reading, they were talking about the evil eye. And the description of it reminded me of an old boss, that when he walked into a room, it was like he sucked all of the energy out of it. And if I had no other way to explain it, I might say that he was stealing a part of my soul. I think a lot of times when we're dealing with people that are depressed, particularly chronically so, after having had a traumatic experience, frequently feel that they've lost a part of themselves. Now, there's all sorts of neurobiological reasons for that, which we're not going to cover today, but certainly there is a soul loss for a good number of people. And in what we are doing, often as we move people through trauma work, is really helping them find lost parts, or in the case where the parts have been never developed because the traumatic experiences began even before there was a language for people to speak, um, perhaps it's to create a part that has never existed quite before, or to develop a part that has never had a chance to fully develop. In other words, we might bring a shadowy part into the sunlight for the first time. So I think this idea of soul loss, while I think many people would look at that and think of it very provincially, I think it is capturing at an essence of something that we all do in clinical work. So how did they help people? They had their pathways to create healing, but they also had specific techniques to allow them to really help those people that needed healing. One of the very first that we talk about is what they call shamanic extraction. This is where we remove bad or hurtful energy. We are, when we talk about bad or hurtful energy, depending on the folklore that you're looking at, it could be things like unresolved anger and grief. It could be sadness. It could be fear. It could be emotions. It could be, related to memories of illness or memories of accidents that won't let the body rest. It could be the memory of a loved one that was taken. It could be all sorts of normal Not that it happens to everybody, but certainly predictable in any population, that there are a number of things that can injure people physically, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. So, this idea of helping extract the bad energy, if you will, is not terribly different than what we do in cognitive behavior therapy, or RABT, or some other models of treatment where we are looking at attacking the irrational belief systems or the thought process system and helping people clarify their thoughts. I think one of the best examples of this is really in the Marshall Linehan's work around DBT. It's a very structured way to help people remove the hurtful and bad energy out of their life. Now, we might call that habits of thinking, but it is essentially removing the hurtful energy and at the same time opening the door to have experiences with good energy. And that's exactly what the shamanic practice was doing as well. Not only was it removing the bad and hurtful energy, but it was also implanting what you might consider to be hope and faith for a future without these things weighing down the person's life on a day-to-day basis. So, just as a kind of an odd question, does it seem like a strange place to start our understanding of trauma to look back at the ancient ways that indigenous healers have used throughout the centuries to help people heal from the hurts that they've experienced? And if you look at, if you really want to have a better understanding of this, there are many, many really good texts written about shamanic practice and indigenous healers. But I think when you start looking at the concepts on which they operate, they used because they worked, they were successful, and they helped people heal. And those basic concepts frequently were very much what we have come to learn are the basic ingredients that help people heal. When some of the research that will be talked about in later weeks, particularly when Eric is talking about the common factors that are functional in all trauma models, you will find that we're going to be talking about the ability to build a relationship, the ability to help people regulate their own bodies and educate them about what's going on. The next one is really kind of helping them do the resolution work, and then finally to develop the ability to deal with the ancillary fallout from the trauma work and move into a state of post-traumatic growth and resiliency. If you think about those as being the core factors of successful trauma treatment, and you compare that to what shamanistic practice has been for the last several thousand years that we have any kind of record, you'll find that they've been doing the same thing that we have discovered because it works. So what I'm going to leave you with, and when we start moving into the rest of the training, is the idea that if it worked with people then, even though we have a much better science today and we have a lot of research to support our efforts, we have a lot of research being done to talk about a best practice or effective treatment. But the underlying core elements or common factors that have always helped people heal from hurts and losses and griefs and traumas have been consistently used for thousands of years. So if we don't know the history of our own profession, how will we benefit from the legacy that they have left us? One of the things that knowing a lot of this history has helped me personally be able to do is not to be a religious zealot over a particular model of treatment. There are a lot of people that I run into that are EMDRites or they're CBTites. And while I have no problem with those models, I think they are excellent. But when they are perceived as the all there is, or the catechism of trauma treatment, there is a problem. And the problem is that their view isn't broad enough. There's not enough scope in the way that they're looking at it. If you were to think about this as a house, even a small house, has many rooms in it, and each room has a different function. I think of a treatment modality, regardless of how wonderful and spectacular it can be, as being a single room in a structure like a house. And when we begin to fool ourselves into thinking that that room represents the whole house, it can actually interfere with our ability to provide the breadth of treatment and support that a client can need sometimes from us. So let me kind of go to a more recent history for you. I'm going to start with Jean Carcat. He was a French physician who was working with traumatized women in a hospital, which at the time he took it over as the lead researcher, administrator, doctor there. There were nearly 5,000 patients in that hospital. And to really call it a hospital is giving it a tremendous amount of grace that it did not possess. This was one of the dark asylum-like, 1800s horrific places to be. Now, under Carcat's direction, they changed a lot of their practices, and it became a kinder place to be, but still a pretty awful place when you start thinking about the history of asylums in general. But Carcat was really one of the first modern people to write about the origins of hysterical symptoms not being physiologic, that was not physiological but psychological in nature. In other words, prior to this, if somebody entered a state of hysteria, which could be very similar to what we would see with a post-traumatic, flashback or dysregulated emotions, where they decompensate emotionally with very few activators or triggers, and it was primarily women that were hysterical, though not all were women. But the number one treatment was to remove the uterus, because it was considered to be the hysteria was related to being a woman and having woman organs. That's not the most awful thing we've done in our histories to help people heal, but it is a pretty good one. He began to reconceptualize it as more of a psychological problem, having a nature that was really based in something outside of these people had changed some way that they looked at things. And so he's one of the first to really kind of allow us to look at something besides just the person being the housing of some kind of huge deficit. He was one of the first practitioners that tried to create a classification system for neurological disorders. And he based them on symptoms which were psychological in nature. Prior to this, I mean, there were systems in place to kind of identify character and personality going all the way back to Theophilus in Greece. But what we're looking at here is he moved it away from attributes of the character or deficits in some physiological part of a person into behavioral symptoms that were psychological in nature. And that was a tremendous change in the way we began to perceive mental health, mental illness, and really began the reformation of how we dealt with it differently. As far as Carcata is concerned, there's material that you're going to be asked to read in this week. I hope you, if he's one of the folks that you decide to read, I think you'll find it very meaningful. I'm going to move from him and give you a brief overview of Pierre Genet. He continued to study what is now considered dissociative phenomena and traumatic memories. He investigated the influence of a patient's history, particularly their traumatic history, on personality and behavior. So what he was basically saying in some of his early writings were that the things that happen to a person as they are developing impacts the personality that they develop and the behaviors they learn to exhibit. That's become a lot more clear as we have moved forward in doing research with trauma. For example, we have today the ACE studies, the Adversity of Childhood Experience studies, which would indicate that 90% of chronic mental health and chronic physical illness occurred to people that had at least 4 developmental traumas throughout their first 18 years of life. And that these traumas have built, if you will, an impact or a force in the life of a person that is still influencing them 50 years later. It's very interesting research, but it isn't a new idea. The idea has been around since Genet was talking about this. He discerned that there were 2 basic kinds of neurotic disturbances, and each of them involved a set of symptoms, and both required a person to become narrowly focused or conscious on a single piece of the world or the reality around them, which in a sense kind of altered the perceptions of the individual. So essentially, the basic symptoms, regardless of what they were, changed the perceptual view, understanding, and understanding of the individual. You might say that if you want to kind of broaden it out and look at it a little differently, that what he's proposing here is that those basic symptoms changed the perceptions people have, the way they experience things physically, the way they give meaning to things, and the way that they behave. So at least in those 4 different areas, these symptoms were impacting those areas and basically leading to a change in the life of this individual. Genet's body of work was primarily neglected and ignored, really, for the popularity of Freud's work. And yet Freud was very good at repackaging other people's ideas. And one of the ideas he repackaged was, of course, some of Pierre Genet's concepts. The psychoanalytic conceptualization really kind of initially interfered with our understanding of trauma. If we'd been able to continue in the direction that Genet was going, we probably would have had a better understanding of how to treat trauma much, much sooner. But with Freud's work, what we did is moved all psychological things into the internal deficit realm again, so that it was really, regardless of what's happening out here in the world, um, those, it is how the interior of the person reacts to those things that we need to be focused with. But by doing that, it disconnected the client from that history of experience. And that became one of the major stumbling blocks as far as working through and being able to identify and how to work with trauma. The last person I'm going to present to you today is Abram Gardner. He was one of the people that first started to treat U.S. war veterans, and he observed the nature of reenactment. In other words, what we call flashbacks. He began to write about how they would move imaginally into their history, that they would act as if they were back in the original event or events, and they were doing that and having the physiological reactions to being there, even though they were physically not there. That a lot of his work, while not talking about flashbacks as an imaginal process, really alludes to that. He formally suggested that traumatic symptoms were normal responses to unbearable situations. Now, that really was a change in modern psychological terms. If you think in shamanic practice, traumatic symptoms were always related to some unbearable situation that was, if not predictable, at least common in a population. And we had abandoned that idea for a long time. But he reintroduced that idea with this concept that traumatic symptoms were normal responses to unbearable situations. So essentially, these behaviors and symptoms were maladaptive or maybe very adaptive processes that allowed people to, in some ways, respond to, protect from, or deal with the traumatic experience or the unbearable situation that they had the opportunity to experience. So I've given you an introduction to shamanic practice. I've talked about Jean Carcat and Genet and Gardner. So why would we be interested in history of the traumatic diagnosis and treatment? And I want to kind of put this in some different terms for a second. Many of you are probably have been exposed to the idea of emotional intelligence. Gardner's work on social intelligence. It was a big production and a big trend in education and in the counseling world in the 90s, particularly the mid 90s and early 2000s. But if you understand his work, you realize what he did is modernized a way of thinking and a way to evaluate that had been actually around since the Mandarin times in China. In fact, all of the qualities that he is addressing as being social or emotional intelligence really were qualities that the Mandarins were evaluating for potential leaders, and they had all sorts of tests to assess it. So if we are so disconnected from history that we don't understand that very few of the things that we see are incredibly new, but many of the things that we see are repackaged or conglomerate ideas from what's in the past. Well, why did it fade in the past? Why didn't it persist? what about that concept didn't make it viable enough to carry into the future? And if it wasn't viable enough to carry into the future in older times, why is it viable today? And that becomes a question that you need to really have a better handle on. So why do we look at history? Number one, so we can avoid the mistakes that were made with concepts and ideas prior. Now, we may think we have a better handle on things because of our tremendous technology and our much better scientific research processes. But a lot of the things that we do therapeutically are just repackaged and repackaged and repackaged from generation to generation. And so if we don't have a better idea of the history of each of our particular areas of expertise, and at this point we're talking about the history of trauma, then what you're going to fall into is kind of that narcissism of thinking the present world and the present ideas that we have as they are right now are the best that they've ever been. There's two problems that primarily with that. Number one, you're not learning from the experiences of history. And number two, if that's your thought process, you're not going to be as open to growth and potential change as you could. And what we find often when we work with people in different consulting capacities and different educational capacities and as trainers is sometimes the idea of letting go of the rigid Catholicism of their model and actually embracing a broader thought process regarding treatment is so uncomfortable for people that they actually withdraw from it and become more rigid. And that's a difficult thing when we are talking about the lives of people, the healing of people, not to have better access to a more curious and open mind on the part of the therapist or counselor. So the biggest lesson of history, as far as I'm concerned, is how are these ideas similar to what has gone before? And if they were good ideas before, why haven't we persisted in them? And or how can we repackage them in such a way so that those ideas can really be effective today? I think with some of the meta-analysis that we're doing, we're finally getting to that place where we are ready to leave the model-specific worldview and move into the principle-based worldview, where we deliver the services based on principles and philosophy rather than a rigid set of performances. And that to me is really good news. That concludes our my video presentation.